Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another TTRPG talk. This video series takes a look at tabletop roleplay games related materials, makes suggestions for your own games, and takes a look at some of my own materials, and does things like this, like looking at game design. Today is going to be continuation of our SRD series. This time we're going to be taking a look at the Schema RPG engine. This is the 7th iteration of it, written by Levi Kornelsen. So again, as I mentioned, this was developed by Levi Kornelsen to create a TTRPG engine that describes itself as being rather light and adaptable without being overly generic. It also utilizes a resolution system that can resolve complicated situations in a single roll and answer more than just, did I succeed? It adds lots of layers. Schema also relies on the use of tokens and the fudge or six-sided dice. Fudge dice, for those of you who don't know what it is, are those over there. Originally, they were utilized for fudge, but of course they're also utilized by the Fate engine. So if you've played any Fate-based games, you might be at least vaguely familiar with these. Of course, you can utilize just standard six-sided dice, and instead you'll just do like 1 and 2 or minus, 5 and 6 or plus, and 3 or 4, the blank sides. So we're going to go ahead and follow the design that Levi kind of laid out and start by exploring exactly how you build a character in Schema first. So a Schema character is built around these things that you see here. Now, one thing that's important to note is that Schema does strongly encourage you to collaboratively develop characters and starting storylines and to a certain extent settings with a session 0. It doesn't necessarily outline the specifics of what Levi feels that really should look like, but it is definitely encouraged that you do a lot of collaborative initial development. So let's dive a bit into some of the specifics of these. Backgrounds provide ongoing bonuses and maybe sometimes have invoked abilities attached that can be applied by utilizing those luck points. Levi kind of sorts these in Schema into 4 different groups. We have boons, which are things outside of your character that they can benefit from. Kith, which are distinct forms of peoples in your world. So, and you might think of this as being like a race or a species in D&D or some other role-playing games. These kith would give you certain abilities and advantages, give you a certain appearance, and so on. Feats is the 3rd type of a background, and these are typically extraordinary physical capabilities that your character might have. And the last one are knacks, and knacks are specifically magical abilities. Now, one thing that's important to note is that in Schema, at least in the initial descriptions of Schema, these knacks are the different magical abilities are a bit on the sort of lower fantasy side. At least they feel that way to me than you might have. And let's say, like, this is not your D&D wizard. This is more like a more classical sort of folk magician, folk witch, who a hedge witch, who has lots of magical abilities that are incredibly useful, but they're a lot less flashy and big. And of course, you could obviously utilize, if you're adapting this for something that's highly not fantasy, of course you could just leave knacks out and kith. You just go with boons and feats. You could also potentially utilize some other items or elements that don't necessarily, let's say if you're adapting something that's not fantasy but still has things that are relatively similar to kith or similar to knacks, you could potentially incorporate those in different ways, right? Skills always have a rank between 1 and 3. The more dice, the higher your rank, the more dice you'll roll whenever you're utilizing them. One thing that's important to note here, though, is that skills also have a field that they fall into. One of the skills that are mentioned specifically, Levi mentioned specifically in the manual, is first aid, right? First aid is obviously a form of medicine. So medicine would be the field. First aid is essentially like a specialization. This is kind of the way to think of this, is that your skills are specializations that fall in a field. If you are skilled in 2 skills that are in the same field, you can actually link them together so that together they have the same rank. So If, let's say, again, I have first aid, right? And I have diagnoses, I can utilize, if I have both of those skills, I can essentially use them as if they were the same rank. And whenever I improve them in the future, they will improve together. Also, when utilizing skills, as I mentioned, obviously, you gain dice equal to the number of ranks that you have whenever this skill applies. But you also can gain dice for if you just have a skill that is in the same field as something that might be able to apply. So again, if my character is being asked to perform a surgery, first aid is only going to get you so far in surgery, but it's going to help at least a little bit. In Schema, it is generally assumed that your character will have the basic gear that you would need to basically do anything. Instead, gear, along with some other systems, are more specialized items or kit that are able to provide conditions to your play, either because they are of incredibly good quality or incredibly poor quality. So as a result, this could potentially add or remove dice from a roll, or they could, again, if they're incredibly poor or incredibly high quality, they could potentially trigger certain elements that improve the results of a roll, or that make a roll more dangerous. And that's the dangers and augments that are mentioned on the slide here, because we'll talk about those in a minute. The last two elements, as I mentioned, that kind of develop a character would be cues and luck. I've already kind of discussed luck to a certain extent already. These are things that are used to influence the fiction by powering your background abilities. Like, again, you might need to use luck in order to trigger some of your magic or your specialized feats. Also, you can use them to enhance rolls. We'll discuss some of the ways that they can do that later. You also should probably flavor luck to best fit your setting. So again, if your characters are all magic folk, right, then maybe the luck is not actually luck. Maybe it's mana from the weave, right? Or it's the Force, right? Or it's for your Star Wars or Star Wars-esque game, right? Or a good example might be it's the weave. For Wheel of Time, right, is something in the background is kind of influencing the storyline, or you could just call them plot points, story points, whatever. Cues are basically a way that your character can gain luck. Each player will basically set a cue that describes the types of interaction that they want to see for their character at the table. So, for example, a cue could be a basic description of their character that kind of describes them in a very specific way, like maybe very, describing their characters being dark and intimidating and right? And so if you interact with that character in a particular way, playing off of that description, maybe then that will be seen as again, kind of playing to the cue, in which case the player who originally developed the cue will then award luck from the pool for the player who's interacting with that, right? And they can do a max. Any player at the table can get a maximum of 1 extra luck point per scene. And this is not coming from like the pool that you have for your specific character. This is coming from a generic pool that kind of sits on the table. So and the guide also can potentially develop some of their own cues, and that those will also be distributed. The guide can also kind of hand out luck, but again, maximum of 1 per player per scene. Now that we've kind of touched on exactly what a character is, we're going to very quickly touch on advancement. There is a very simple mechanical experience point based enhancement system for Schema. Each character at the end of each session should normally be receiving between 1 to 3 hit experience points, depending upon the speed of the. This says the speed of the session. It shouldn't say that. I meant to say the speed of the campaign, essentially, right? If you're playing a real quick campaign where you're only going to do like 3 or 4 sessions, then handing out HP like candy might make sense. But obviously, if this is a slow, long burn, you're going to want to be handing out a lot less common. What are you going to spend these experience points on? Well, buying a new skill is 1 experience point. Increasing your rank in a skill is whatever the cost of the new rank would be. Again, if you're buying a new skill and it's in a field that you already have a skill in, then you would just start that skill at whatever rank level the existing skill is at. If you won't need to buy a new background, your experience points the experience points cost of that will normally be whatever the new number of backgrounds you have. So if I have, again, when you're creating a character, you start off with 2. So if you're adding another one, then that would be 3 experience points. However, Levi does suggest that if your game structure is heavily dependent on backgrounds, because you're utilizing backgrounds in your game to sort of introduce some sorts of structures that don't exist otherwise mechanically in the game, then you might want to instead just have it be a flat cost of 3 XP per background, just to keep from players at the table from just hoarding their XP because they're trying to buy like every single background that's out there. Now that we've discussed our characters, let's start taking a look at exactly how those characters interact with the game itself. So we're going to do that by taking a look at the resolution mechanics for the game. For Schema, the engine. Whenever you are preparing to do a roll, these are all of the different steps that take place. First off, the situation is determined, right? We figure out exactly what's going on and what needs to happen, right? Where is the roll and what does it need to do, okay? Then the player will determine, working with the guide, who is like the game master, the GM for this game, will determine the style of the character's approach. Is this character doing this action in a very bold and outright way, or are they playing things cautiously? Because those will have an influence on the roll itself. Then we lay out stakes, which kind of determine exactly like what are the dangers and what are some things that we could get out of this. What are some benefits we could get out of this? After that's been determined, the player can then spend luck to potentially change their style if they feel that the way they were approaching this situation originally isn't really going to work. You then build the dice pool, taking into account skills and conditions, and then we do the roll. We assign dice to the stakes that we laid out, and then the guide describes the outcome based on the roll of the dice and how the stakes played out. So let's take a look at each of those elements one at a time. Now, style. As I mentioned, we have bold or cautious. How is your character going to approach this situation? After the initial roll, depending upon the approach, you are going to be re-rolling either your all of your blank dice and either your positive or your negative dice, depending upon the approach that you took. If you would like to, you can use a point of luck to either keep the original dice you have and not have to re-roll, because that re-roll happens no matter what, unless you spend a luck point. Or you can spend luck points to do a second re-roll if your first re-roll was undesirable. Now, question is, why mechanically we would want to do this? Well, this actually skews the results of your roll, of course, right? If I'm doing something bold, right, and I'm re-rolling my blank and negative dice, then that means inherently I am not a lot more likely, but I am more likely to get more positive dice, because some of those dice from the second roll could end up coming up positive, of course. There's like a 33% chance, right? So in other words, this skews your results to either make the roll less dangerous for your character if you're playing things cautiously, or more impactful if you're playing things boldly, because then you're potentially gaining extra augments. But of course, the reverse is true as well. It is, if you're playing things boldly, then you're getting fewer dice that you can use to basically buy off any dangers in your roll, which could be potentially fatal, actually, depending upon exactly how the roll is going to end up coming out. As I mentioned, we have stakes, right? There are 3 different types of stakes in this game. We have automatic stakes, which are basically things that are going to happen no matter what, just because this roll is happening, that are kind of determined by the game master. So, the basics of your action that you request are probably going to happen. It's just a question of how big it's going to be, how impressive it's going to be, or how subtle it's going to be. It depends on how you want this to play out, right? Then we have 2 different types of stakes that are determined by the guide, and I would assume probably also players at the table. We have dangers and we have augments. Now, dangers, the ones over here, dangers are the ones that, again, are typically set by the guide before the roll, and you can put multiple tokens on these things. These are things that are going to be costs, or things that are going to potentially make this situation, again, dangerous, right, for our player or people around them, or the character or people around them, because of the action. So, for example, one of the ones over here we have is fatigue, right? It's going to make doing this is going to make you tired, right? Injury, doing this might get you hurt, right? Augments, meanwhile, are things that you could potentially gain as a result of this roll. So, if I get more positive dice later on, I might be able to. The guide before the roll might decide that certain augments will have certain effects even before the roll happens. So, for example, if I'm trying to do something big, right, the guide might say, okay, you can try doing something big. Your initial roll is only going to have an effect this big, but if you get more augments that you can then spend on scope right there, we can make it bigger, right? Or speed, we can make it happen faster, right? Or duration, we can make it happen for a longer period of time, right? These are all different sorts of advantages or augments that we could potentially gain from your roll. How do we build the dice pool, though? Well, as we already mentioned previously, the ranks that you have, you gain. If you have a skill that applies directly, you gain that many dice, just as your base dice pool, or that rank -1 if you have a skill from the same field. A player then also gets to call on one condition to help them. Either this could be a gear item that you have. It could be something from the environment, an ally who can help you, something like that. You're calling on a condition that gives you extra dice between 1 and 3, to that essentially, so you can have up to 6 dice that you're rolling. The guide can also call on an opposed call. This would be basically like a condition in the environment that is acting. That would normally be making this more difficult. This can add a dice malus, like wounded, let's say, right? But it can also just add extra danger to the stakes of the roll. So, for example, if the environment says that it is cold and windy, and I'm trying to survive, then that would presumably be an opposed roll that could add danger to the stakes, either fatigue or injury or something along those lines. Now, of course, once the dice pool has been built, we've decided exactly what the stakes are and everything else. we roll the dice. Again, as I mentioned, normally you will re-roll some of the dice once, depending upon the style you're doing, either cautious or bold. The player, however, can spend luck points to prevent the re-roll or roll a second time, as we mentioned. So now we have our dice. It's all set. Now it's time to assign stakes and outcomes. So if you'll recall back to that table of stakes that I had, we'll have had tokens laid out on that earlier to determine what the different dangers are ahead of time. I'm going to be using negative dice to potentially buy away the tokens on the danger side of that dice, or on that table. And then using the positive dice to potentially add tokens to the augments side of the table. So for example, if before I did, let's go back to my survival example, right? I need to survive. The guide decided to add 3 tokens to injury, because if I don't succeed very well at this, then I could potentially get injured, right, in my survival. Whether it's I trip and fall and hurt myself, or maybe add a condition, being hungry, right? I can then use my negative dice to potentially buy those away. Like, let's say I get 2 negative dice, so I'm able to buy away 2 points of the injury. But so I only get a little injured instead of very injured. Let's say I have some augments, so I'm able to apply those to certain things. Like I gained an advantage where, yes, I survived and I found out some new information that could be useful for me later, right? So the guide will basically determine the outcome based on whatever dangers remained on the left side of that table. The augments, whatever augments are added to the right side of the table, and then whatever the predetermined automatic stakes were from the beginning. Kind of taking all of that and adding it together, the guide determines exactly what the outcome was and how the story moves forward from there. That is essentially the basics of how the structure of Schema works. Now the question is, what else is in here? Because of course, this is a 60 some odd page. This is a 60-page document, and you could honestly describe that in a lot less than 60 pages. Of course, that's because there's more stuff in here. There are a number of different examples of play situations utilizing the schema's mechanics. This includes your normal sort of your normal sort of actual play sort of descriptions of certain situations, but also there's also suggestions on how to utilize the various mechanics in slightly different ways than is written sort of in the initial elements. So for example, how you could handle tracking political situations with factions and stuff like that, or how to basically create scandal conditions that operate in a similar way to the way that fatigue or wounding generally act in sort of the layered or nested conditions in the structure for Schema. There are also a number of situations where where Levi has created a list of suggested stakes for situations. So, for example, whenever your character is fighting, crafting, chase scenes, a list of different sorts of dangers or augments that you might want to throw into the situation to kind of help. This is not only to help the guide figure out exactly how to basically set this out, but also to try to help the player get a better idea of what they might expect whenever they're going into a situation like this. In here, there are also 2 supplemental settings, both of which come with slightly different alternative mechanics. And then the last thing that's in here that I'm going to want to discuss briefly, because of course it's of a great importance to anybody who's trying to utilize Schema to develop a game, would be the unlicense that's attached to this. Now, the fact that it's called the unlicense, I take as being kind of like a comment related towards OGL, not the most recent controversy, because I think that this unlicense was written before that happened, or exclusivity licenses in general. because even though it's called an unlicensed, it is definitely a legal license. So keep that in mind. Basically, the unlicensed says that Schema can be used in commercial or non-commercial products. So you don't need to worry about if you want to make something that you're going to get paid for. However, you need to follow a certain set of rules. First off, you need to note that Schema was created by Levi Kornelsen and specify if you reuse any text from the manual directly, as opposed to just utilizing the mechanics without actually reusing any of the words, let's say. Another thing that is requested is that you have to include a link to a storefront or distribution channel, Levi's words, where Schema can be acquired together. Basically, what you can do is essentially treat this unlicensed for Schema as if it was a Creative Commons attribution license. In the fact that the description of this sort of unlicensed is incredibly similar to that, with the exception of needing to add a link to Schema somewhere, as opposed to just basically saying this is based on Schema that was created by Levi Kornelsen, and then leave it at that. You have to actually, so basically when you write your description on like that license page or first page or whatever page you stick it on, right? When you say my game is based on the Schema 7th iteration by Levi Kornelsen, you have to also add, and by the way, you can find it here at this link. And essentially it's exactly the same as, otherwise it's exactly the same as Creative Commons, because you can, you reuse text, you can reuse it in any way you want. And that was Schema. Thank you all for joining us again here today. Links, of course, to the manual can be, to the RPG Engine manual itself can be found down below in the description. You will find there at the storefront that it is also available with a character sheet and the stakes sheet that you saw in the slideshow here, and a number of other small resources that would be very useful for someone potentially attempting to utilize this. Only lightly modified. I would obviously recommend that you definitely take a look deeper at it and do a lot of tinkering with the structure to fit whatever setting you'd like. But yeah, I would definitely say that this is a game that, again, it's themed towards fantasy. The roles are a bit more complicated, and they add a lot of nuance to the structure. So I wouldn't say that this is probably going to run as slow as, let's say, a D&D session, where there's a lot of debate and discussion, and because there isn't a whole lot of math, right? It's just, do I roll 6, 7? How many dice do I roll? It's got to be somewhere between 1 and 6, right? And how many tokens are going to be putting on the table, and just removing it. There's a lot more physical and tactile, and a lot less mental math. So in that way, I think that this might be a good game for people who aren't necessarily big fans of the math and really like being able to move things around on the table. That's a good element to kind of add into this, and it also adds a layer of structure, I feel, to sort of like the theater of the mind elements without actually creating minifigs on the table. Just to kind of adds a layer again of that tactile structure to the actual consequences of what's happening, without making it feel like you're playing chess. Ursula Le Guin novel would be a good fit, I feel, for this particular game structure. I could definitely see doing Legends of Earthsea with this or something like that. But anyway, Thank you all for joining us again here today. Links will be found again in the doobly-doo down below. At the title card at the end, there will also be a nice little display showing you different videos from our channel, including the SRD series that this is going to be a part of. Please feel free to, of course, subscribe, like, ring the notification bell, take a look at other materials that we have, like the website, and have a good zone. And don't forget to rate your itch purchases. If you would like to show your support for this channel or for the Hessens County blog, in the description down below you will find links to the channel coffee and also the itch store. Please feel free to take a look, and thank you for your support.